Hello, everyone. My name is Spencer Walsh. It is my pleasure to welcome you to another season of Hidden History, probably one of the most popular podcasts I've ever created here on SWRN. You've joined us just in time for an incredible summer of breaking down and adding context to some of the most important yet under-discussed events in world and American history that have shaped our modern life, shaped our relationships with other countries, shaped concepts and political realities that we take as for granted as we take the law of gravity today in our life. Keep in mind, this is not a conspiracy podcast, although sometimes the true history is so crazy it may feel like I'm talking like Alex Jones. That all starts today, as we will delve into an event that has shaped two major factors of current American life. Number one, this event gave rise to the national security state that grew to fight the Cold War, and the countless coups and interventions that entailed and fundamentally shaped our relationship with a country that is today one of our biggest adversaries. This is Hidden History, specifically the episode on the coup that overthrew the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh, in 1953. It really was the one that started it all in a pretty big way for America. We'll get into all that stuff, but we have to start where a lot of our stories, I believe, will probably start this season and have started in the past, which is around the World War II period. And we start specifically towards the middle of that period. The British and the Soviets controlled the territory of Iran during that period. They kind of swooped in, kind of put it in a holding pattern, controlling that oil for the period, and both had pockets of influence within the country. However, as the war came to a close, the Soviets lost total interest in the region, and after starting a few socialist groups, largely pulled out. The Brits, however, had pretty deep ties to the region through the form of what was then the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, or the APOC, which later would become the AIOC, the American Iranian Oil Company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and eventually BP, British Petroleum, today. They had received the ability to search for oil, the permit to search for oil, for 60 years in 1901 from the then Shah, which means, again, king, in Persian, Muzaffar Din Shah al-Kahar, in 1901 as a plan to pay debts owed to the British. Keep in mind, the rights were only for 60 years under the original agreement. So obviously, the UK worked well with the long line of Shahs that came through from 1901 till the end of the Second World War, particularly with Reza Shah, the leader in the wake of the Second World War. The Shah had pretty much absolute power and was not afraid to use it, whether to pass laws, control dissent, or, as we'll get into, really shape the political economy of the country in a pretty big way. In 1949, there was an attempt on his life. In response, he quickly moved to seize more power, creating a new constituent assembly to try and essentially amend the constitution in his favor, which he did. He convened the first Iranian Senate, which was formed originally under the Constitution of 1906, but had never been convened because, it was a little dicey conflict-wise around that time with two world wars. But he, according to that Constitution, was allowed to pick half of the men in that Senate, and obviously picked those loyal to him. Meanwhile, a longtime parliamentarian, Mohammed Mossadegh, rode a wave of anger at the decades of foreign meddling in Iranian affairs to become one of the leaders of a budding Iranian nationalist movement. After the war, the movement was turned on its ire towards the APOC, by that time the AIOC, again, which would later become British Petroleum, and demanded an audit to determine the Iranian government was being paid what it was owed. The Brits refused this call, much to the chagrin originally of the Americans too, because of some of the just the trouble they were causing at the time. And pressure really grew on them. And the Iranian government that was at the time completely cooperating with the British oil company, because the IOC was already greatly profitable. They were essentially giving scraps to the Iranian government, and they couldn't even prove or make public the amount of scraps that they said that they were giving was the right amount relative to their total, large amount of profits. The nationalists then pushed for a 50-50 split in revenue between the government and the company in 1949, but were shut down both by the government and by the company. This really did piss a lot of Iranians off, and their continued intransigence. I don't know if you know Persians. They're pretty proud people. They like to have control over their lands. And a lot of this kind of instinct, a lot of this anger comes from many, many decades of colonization, foreign interference, and the Brits seem to be essentially the last straw. This AIOC and the intransigence of it, and the way they behaved began to garner some support. Their behavior began to garner some support within the public for essentially saying, why don't we nationalize this company? In March, the pro-Western Prime Minister, Ali Razmara, was assassinated, and the next month, the parliament legislated the petroleum industry's nationalization, creating the National Iranian Oil Company in 1951. This legislation was guided by the Western-educated Dr. Mohammed Mossadegh, then a member of the Iranian parliament and leader of the nationalization movement, as we discussed. By May, the Shah had appointed Mossadegh prime minister, commenting that Mossadegh had opposed his father's appointment as Shah way back when, because he had a pretty big history of nationalization or supportive nationalization. Reza Pahlavi, the Shah at the time, explained that though wary of Mossadegh's brand of nationalism and his violent anti-British sentiment, he believed that his experience was needed at the time of crises. Essentially, this was kind of a sap to the people to say, hey, we're putting one of your guys in here. He's been pretty angry at the British before. He's one of you. He's a nationalist. Just let's chill out. It's getting a little bit hairy here. We need a voice to kind of placate, essentially, was how that worked. He also hoped that he would be cautious in asserting Iran's rights, since the path to political and economic independence was full of pitfalls, he said, as from atop his golden Tehran throne. Okay, now we're going to do a little bit of a sidebar and tell you about a name. And that name is Avril Harriman, who, in my research and these hidden history projects and other things I've read for various extracurriculars, just kind of interested in this stuff, he has come up many, many times. He is an oil man. He's a quote-unquote U.S. diplomat. He's essentially a almost grim reaper of sorts who goes to countries that need these natural resources or want to keep control of their natural resources, to try and work something out, try and talk something out. But by many accounts, he has deep connections to intelligence and CIA/OSS forces. For those you don't know, OSS was the precursor during the World War II era to the CIA, and eventually formed the CIA in the mid-50s. He is someone who pretty much always comes and precedes something very, very dark happening. Usually it involves oil and the CIA. So keep that in mind. That summer in 1951, the very same Avril Harriman went to Iran to negotiate an Anglo-Iranian compromise, asking the Shah's help. His reply was, in the face of public opinion, there's no way he could say a word against nationalization. Harriman held a press conference in Tehran calling for reason and enthusiasm in confronting the, quote, nationalization crisis. I mean, to them it was a crisis, but to the Iranian people, who are largely in support of it, it was a goal. It was something that really represented for them in this kind of broad push towards self-determination and liberation, especially in the global south around that time. It really represented a goal and a way that Iranians could see themselves as kind of truly independent. As soon as he spoke, a journalist rose and shouted, "We and the Iranian people all support Premier Mossadegh and oil nationalization." Everyone began cheering and then marched out of the room. The abandoned Harriman shook his head in dismay.
W. Averill Harriman, U.S. envoy at large, is greeted by Ambassador Grady as he arrives in Tehran to attempt arbitration in the explosive oil nationalization crisis. He will seek to reconcile views of the British interests and Iranian nationalists. Before undertaking his mission, he pays a visit to the Shah's palace and returns the recent visit paid to the United States by the Iranian monarch. He pays his respects to the Shah, who is recuperating from a recent operation. Despite the cordial reception given Mr. Harriman by government officials, his arrival is the signal for demonstrations by communist-inspired members of the Tudeh National Party. Right and left groups clash. The conflict, which starts in Parliament Square, requires strenuous efforts on the part of mounted police before it is quelled. During the outbreaks, which lasted several hours and ranged over many city blocks, it is estimated that 10 persons were killed, including 2 police, and 60 were injured. A demonstration by a party outlawed in Iran. Mr. Harriman undertakes a series of conferences with Prime Minister Mossadegh. Out of these conferences, hope emerges that the crisis that threatens world peace may now be averted.
The two-day party really was one of the most effective and clear instances of what was really just Iranian outrage at the time and a real massive explosion in public opinion when it came towards the support of the creation of this national Iranian oil company. And this was really kind of a remarkable time. This was the summer of 1951 where he arrived. Again, 10,000 protesters. There were a chance of death to Harriman. And as the very old-timey British newscaster said, more than 20 people were killed and 2,000 wounded in the protests. This really did set off some anger in Iran, as the British cabinet opposed a series of economic sanctions against Iran as they moved towards a push to kind of nationalize their oil finally. And it really set off a very interesting kind of call and response of just kind of a tit for tat, a back and forth between the much more powerful, much more financially connected British government and the very much pissed off Mossadegh and the Shah, who was kind of caught in the middle of it, who kind of just had to be there as the constitutional monarch in the government. He had to appoint Mossadegh as prime minister. He hoped he would be kind of chill. It turned out, well, he was not that chill. He was really representing the Iranian people who, by all accounts, were very much not chill about continued British control of oil. But again, it kind of set off this tit for tat, prohibiting the export of key British commodities as kind of how the British responded there, including sugar and steel to Iran. It directed the withdrawal of all British personnel from Iranian oil fields in a pretty hardcore show of force, as 300 administrators from Abadan, the largest oil field in the region, were kicked out. None of this information was given to them. And because of that, really, first off the bat, as the National Iranian Oil Company was formed in the kind of late 1951, early 1952, and suffered some decreased production because of Iranian inexperience and the AIOC's refusal to kind of work with British technicians, thus provoking, again, this Abadan crisis between 1951 and 1954. That was then, again, aggravated by the Royal Navy's blockade of export markets. So not only did they really try and sabotage the transition between British to Iranian hands that they clearly absolutely hated to every single possible degree, they also blockaded all of the Iranian oil from reaching the market and tried to organize and successfully organize a worldwide boycott of Iranian petroleum. They also froze Iran's hard currency and accounts in British banks. Really did have a pretty negative impact on the shape of the Iranian government. The UK took its anti-nationalization case against Iran to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. Believe it or not, we actually had a functioning Hague at some point in our history, where it would be people other than just African dictators who get tried and found guilty. But this would be a pretty tough one. This would be the literal United Kingdom, the British Empire, against a poor Arab country that was just trying to get its oil back. They essentially said that they were owed this oil. It was rightfully theirs. They were good to drill it. Mossadegh responded by saying the world would learn of a cruel and imperialistic country stealing from a needy and naked people. Representing the AIOC, the UK actually lost its case, yet worried about other Iranian interests, believing the misconception that the Iran kind of push for nationalization was Soviet-backed. Well, no, it's just against you, that's for sure. Sorry, England. In this event, this fear of the Soviets, they called in another man. The British did. They called in another man who I would say is a grim reaper of American history, a true grim reaper of American history, someone who has led, participated in, helped to organize some of the worst, kind of most tragic events and things, and frankly crimes that America has done to global South countries. Whenever you see his name or you see the name of his brother, you always know that these are just, again, true. Harriman not so much, but these two guys, true villains in American mid 20th century history, because they were just in the midst of everything. They were getting their friends together. They were organizing funds. They were doing kind of secret meetings. And it seemed like they were, pretty normal people. They have an airport named after them in D.C., but boy, were they definitely up to something. So the British approached this guy, Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles. His brother is Alan Dulles, by the way. I'm sure we will hear more about them as the season goes on. I'd be shocked if I had mentioned at least one of them or maybe both multiple times in this podcast history. But anyway, they persuaded John Foster Dulles that Iran was falling to the Soviets, effectively exploiting this American Cold War fear, this domino effect. For the British, it was relatively material. It was the fact that they were losing an incredibly profitable entity in the global South. And it was also, let's be honest, a sign of just real disappointment, a sign of insecurity about the fact that they were losing their empire. They weren't the truly great British Empire anymore. They were rapidly losing ground in a moment that was remarkably focused towards self-determination and liberation from colonial powers and just general decolonization the world over. They got John Foster Dulles, who, again, was totally hell-bent on kind of exploiting this anti-communist fear that had took place, really taken off at this time in American domestic politics, and was looking towards using it abroad. Keep this in mind, because this foundational playbook of, communist dictator taking control, doing things he shouldn't. This is Soviet influence. This could be a real problem, guys. We need to really step in and do something about this. This was a classic playbook that has been used countless times in countless circumstances, somewhat similar, somewhat different. Each time is obviously going to be a little bit different, but boy, oh boy, have we seen this play or this playbook being used before. And for example, just a few years later in Guatemala with Jacobo Arbenz, that is 100% something that was built and kind of test cased in Iran in 1953, really for the first major time. Well, there were some kind of operations happening concurrently. This was the case that wrote the playbook for the Americans especially. Stunningly, though, even though John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State under Truman at the time, was pretty much on board, pretty for it, Harry Truman never agreed to the overthrowing of Mossadegh. But he wasn't long for the job. Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1953, and they convinced him to do a joint coup d'etat, opposing Iran's only democratically elected government in order to reestablish, foreign control, meaning British control of Iranian oil. Next, we have to kind of get into the origins here, how this eventually happened, and especially the context the Cold War played in it. It was a very big debate here, and kind of still is, although we kind of are pretty clear, the Soviets did have some influence. The Tudeh party, which was associated with Mossadegh, it was a pretty big nationalist party, a pretty big communist party as well. Occasionally did receive some funds from Moscow, some donations. It was pretty clear that, especially compared to what was happening in Korea at the time, it was relatively clear that the Soviets were largely kind of hands out of this one. As I said, they did have some influence in the kind of World War II period. They created some kind of communist groups, some socialist groups, but especially compared to, at the same time, their influence that we saw in Korea, their influence with China, and that kind of triumvirate forming over in the East, that was certainly causing a lot of people in the West a lot of consternation. It seemed like this dynamic just was not at play in Iran, but that did not stop a lot of people from speculating. After World War II, the USSR's Allied agreed domain included Central Asia and much of Eastern Europe. As the Iranians nationalized the country's petroleum on June 26, 1950, North Korea, with Soviet approval, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. And this kind of mindset I was talking about really does paint the picture. This is a British diplomat at the time, Sam Fowle, said, quote, 1952 was a very dangerous time. The Cold War was hot in Korea. The Soviet Union had tried to take all Berlin in 1948. Stalin was still alive. On no account could the Western powers risk a Soviet takeover of Iran, which would almost certainly have led to World War III. Of course, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah at the time, so the Soviets supported Mossadegh, planning to use him to overthrow the monarchy, then eliminate him 2 weeks after my departure. According to the Shah, Mossadegh wanted nothing more than to oust the Pahlavi dynasty. Others argued the communist danger did not pose a real threat. Because, I think the Shah probably has some motivated reasoning to want to call Mossadegh a socialist puppet or a Soviet puppet. The Tudeh did not initially even support Mossadegh either, and they lacked sufficient support to take over the government. Historian Holliday says that they only openly supported Mossadegh, who was anti-communist during the last year of his government. He was, relatively kind of moderate, relatively liberal, but he reflected a huge swath of Iran who wanted the British out at all costs. But as the friction continued with the really remarkable growing rift and the growing economic tit for tat, as we talked about, between Iran and Britain, and obviously the Shah giving Mossadegh a fair bit of grief on top of it, Mossadegh just simply said, I'm out, I'm resigning, I can't do this anymore, and I give up. But the Iranian people were not happy about that. When he resigned, and Ahmad Gavam took over due to the Shah's appointment, 3 days of rioting ensued. Chaos all over as they called for the return of Mossadegh. And just 3 days later, again, from the 17th to 22nd of July in 1952, that's how long Ahmad Gavam was able to become prime minister. The Shah, under immense pressure, then reappointed Mossadegh. As 1952 turned to 1953, it became increasingly clear that through both countries, both the United States and the United Kingdom, through different reasons, they had to get this guy out. He was just becoming too big of a problem. Economic warfare wasn't really working. He was very, very popular with the Iranian people. The 3 days of rioting after his ouster, I think, certainly shows that, they may not have loved everything about the guy, but they definitely wanted someone who would be a known nationalist champion in power. And he was again eventually had to be reappointed. So the Iranians loved him, and it became pretty clear that the British and the Americans kind of hated him for similar but different reasons. The British, obviously, because they were losing that material interest, because they were losing the support of the empire, and also for the Americans, it was obviously a bit about the Cold War. It was a bit about the threat of communism in every single possible nook and cranny around the world that they had to ceaselessly fight off. And again, this operation was what was being built kind of at the time with people like John Foster Dulles, people like the leaders in the CIA at the time, people like Avril Harriman, who would be involved in a lot of other similar situations down the road in terms of kind of the misadventures of U.S. imperialism around that time. And it really did kind of come to, and for the Americans, not only was it geopolitically advantageous, kind of keep out the quote-unquote Soviets, make a friendly American government in that part of the world, get it right close there next to Turkey, who was another NATO member at the time. And it also did kind of come down to a possible, a pretty good American advantage, because if they were to assist the British in the overthrow of the Mossadegh regime and the nationalization regime and the quote-unquote nationalization crisis, they would also be able to get their toes in the water as well. As a condition for restoring the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, the U.S. required collapsing the AIOC's monopoly. 5 American petrol companies, Royal Dutch Shell and the Compagnie Française de Pétrole, were to withdraw Iran's petroleum after the successful coup d'etat, which at the time finally got its name, Operation Ajax. As part of that, the CIA organized anti-communist guerrillas to fight the Tudeh party if they seized power in the chaos following Operation Ajax. Per the released National Security Archive documents, Undersecretary of State Walter Bedell Smith reported that the CIA had agreed with the Qashqai tribal leaders in southern Iran to establish a clandestine safe haven from which U.S.-funded guerrillas and spies could operate. While the British were the most benefited from this thing, it certainly seems like the Americans were building at this time, creating this strategy, the stay-behind guerrilla groups, fighting these kind of socialist leaders. Where does that sound familiar? For example, I don't know, Mujahideen, right next door. Anyway, but they were kind of preparing this kind of quote-unquote stay-behind network, this kind of group to cause trouble if the coup didn't work out. Meanwhile, the coup d'etat depended on the impotent Shah's dismissing the powerful and popular prime minister and replacing him with General Fazlollah Zahedi, with help from Colonel Abbas Farzanegan, a man agreed by the British and the Americans after determining his anti-Soviet politics. The BBC spearheaded the British propaganda campaign, broadcasting the Go Code and launching the coup d'etat against Iran's elected government. At the start, the coup d'etat briefly faltered, and the Shah fled from Iran. However, after a short Italian exile, it was the CIA who returned him to Iran. General Zahedi replaced and deposed Prime Minister Mossadegh, who was arrested, given a show trial, and condemned to death. Showing a generosity of spirit, however, the Shah commuted Mossadegh's death sentence to 3 years solitary confinement in a military prison, followed by perpetual house arrest. It took until 2000 when the New York Times newspaper partially published a censored version of the CIA document Clandestine Service History, Overthrow of Premier Mossadegh of Iran, November 1952 to August 1953, describing the planning and execution of the Anglo-American coup d'etat. The newspaper published this as a scanned image, not machine-readable text. But the damage was done. It took 2000 for us to find out, but the damage was done. Iranian oil was taken out of the hands of the government, I should say the democratically elected government of Iran, and put in place of the hands of the Shah. And the Shah, make no mistake about it, was a pretty brutal guy. An immediate consequence of the coup d'etat was the political repression of the National Front opposition, and especially the Tudeh party, and concentration of political power in the Shah and his courtiers. Reports and historians say that the Shah exercised complete political control using his secret service, the Savak, and military to crush anyone critical of the regime. Another effect, however, was the sharp improvement of Iran's economy, as the British-led oil embargo against Iran ended and suddenly things were looking up. There's nothing like a boost to the economy than agreeing to placate the two majorly powerful companies that were conspiring to tank it. It's pretty convenient. Another effect, however, was, despite Iran not controlling its national oil, the Shah agreed to replace the Anglo-Iranian oil company with a consortium, which is British Petroleum and 8 European and American oil companies. As a result, oil revenues decreased from $34 million from 1954 to 55 to $181 million 1956 to 57 and continued to increase. Meanwhile, the United States sent development aid and advisors. The CIA maintained a pretty big presence in Iran, where Soviet agents were also located. Iran also received economic aid from the Soviets, which is pretty cool. The fact that they were just given $280 million of aid from the Soviets. They're kind of really playing both sides there, which is actually crazy. The Soviets would do that. According to a former Soviet agent, the Shah survived at least one KGB assassination attempt where an explosive device failed to detonate. However, in the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. played the role that Britain had earlier in, quote-unquote, running Iran. This is a very, very important thing to understand. They kind of assumed the role of a puppet master of the Iranian government, controlling the Shah, supporting the Shah in any way that he needed, and allowing him to have pretty much absolute free reign over the Iranian people. It was really an undeniable loss for the Iranian people, who were put back under the yoke of a dictator who was known for disappearing people, cracking down on all dissent, and of course, having complete control over all laws. It showed Iran that they couldn't have democracy. They couldn't have a secular democracy that controlled its own resources, set its own destiny, and was allowed to grow its own economy. It was either stuck with, or at least seemed to be stuck with, a completely U.S.-controlled dictator that was very, very unpopular, and really there was no voice for Iranians to have any kind of political mobility in their own situation. And that obviously led to discontent that grew. And because of that, many, many people would say, and especially because the secular option in 1953 had been ruled out, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 happened, where instead of returning to a Mossadegh-style nationalization of resources and kind of a very left-wing secular government, we got a right-wing theocratic Islamic revolution in 1979 that really, arguably, I think it's pretty actually inarguable if you look at some of the facts, put Iran in what may even been even a worse situation of repression relative to their time under the Shah's yoke, which was really something that a lot of people found pretty hard to do, but it was something that, kind of eventually worked. The sight of the Shah of Iran fleeing the country until foreigners rethroned him during this revolutionary period, this time of the coup, where he had to flee and have this kind of Italian exile before he was brought back, was really a major cause of his deposition in the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Those actions by the religious revolutionaries severed, obviously, American-Iranian relations until, to how they are to this day, frankly. And it was really a big part of the distrust and the hatred that many Iranians still feel towards America, even as things are obviously a lot different now. But that bitterness was still there, bubbling under the surface until 1979. It really kind of fully exploded. The actions severed the relations, and remembering the embassy's command center role in the 1953 coup d'etat, the American embassy, it led them to preventative occupation in 1979, obviously taking the embassy workers and helping make, or inspire, I guess, Argo. It was a pretty good movie. Anyway, Jacob Hornberger, founder and president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, said, quote, U.S. officials, not surprisingly, considered the operation one of their greatest foreign policy successes, until, that is, the enormous convulsion that rocked Iranian society with the violent ouster of the Shah and the installation of a virulently anti-American Islamic regime in 1979. According to him, the coup in essence paved the way for the rise of power of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the rest that's happened right up to 9/11 and beyond. Again, on a really side note, Iran had absolutely nothing to do with 9/11. That's kind of completely ridiculous. But a lot of American actions in that region paved the way for the rise of radical Islam and arguably the terrorists who felt the need to commit such an atrocity as 9/11. That's obviously a topic for several other episodes. But internationally, the 1953 coup was the first time the U.S. had overthrown an elected civil government. It was a really big deal. And the U.S. Operation Ajax, it was a success with immediate and far-reaching effect. Overnight, the CIA became a central part of American foreign policy, especially the American foreign policy apparatus. And covert action came to be regarded as a cheap and effective way to achieve geopolitical goals, aka stop the Soviets, and really shape the course of world events. A coup against the elected Guatemalan government of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman, which had nationalized farmland owned by the United Fruit Company, followed the next year, following much of the same playbook. The U.S.-British support for dictatorial rule of the Shah and their overthrowing of Mossadegh's government has attracted a censure as an example of duplicity. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who knew something about setbacks for democracy, called it a setback for democratic government in Iran. On the other hand, the U.S. and Great Britain speak about their commitment to spreading democracy and opposing tyranny. On the other hand, they appear to compromise their principles when their own economic or strategic interests are threatened. And this was really the first time. Again, you may be listening to this like, hey, tell us something we don't know. Well, this is where it started. And that's why I wanted to start our season here. You know, I hope it makes sense now, because this was essentially the apparatus. This is when the apparatus was built. This is when the playbook of sowing dissent, creating these militia groups, you know, using Cold War socialist rhetoric, using the CIA to kind of go covert, and finding special allies within the government that are opposed to the controversial, almost always left-wing or pro-nationalism leader. You know, that is something that was started here, was perfected here, and used many, many other times up until this very day. It's still going on. And that's really why this Iranian 1953 coup against Mohammed Mossadegh was the coup that started them all. Thanks so much for listening. It's been Hidden History. Be back next week.